Hello students, welcome to Chapter 10, Lesson 3. Let's get into this. We've got some action today. In the late 1700s, the business of American shipping on the high seas was good. Merchants were making mucho grande cash. Why, you ask? Well, American merchants were expanding their horizons. For example, the Empress of China returned from China. It was a merchant ship with a literal boatload of Chinese goods, such as silk and tea, and they made a ton of money, and other ships soon followed. Trade increased with places like China, as well as India, South America, Africa, and places along the Mediterranean Sea. In the 1790s, Britain and France were at war again. Their respective merchants basically stayed home for fear of being captured by the other side, and American shipping sort of filled that void. So we were making big money trading with Britain and France while all their merchants stayed home. They made lots of money, but as is said by the notorious B.I.G., mo money, mo problems. So we ended up getting in trouble with this shipping issue, filling this void, making all this money. There's going to be problems, pirate problems. So the pirate problem really takes place in the Mediterranean Sea. Pirates from what are called the Barbary states of North Africa, countries like Tripoli, Morocco, Tunis, and Algiers, there was a long-standing situation where these pirates would demand tribute, or basically like a payment, from European countries, and in return they wouldn't attack their ships. And if it wasn't paid, the Barbary states would basically, if they found your nation's ships floating around the Med, they would steal the ship and take the crew into slavery. Most of Europe basically found it easier and cheaper just to pay the tribute because they didn't want to deal with the problem. Then comes the United States. So the U.S. had actually been paying tribute. A significant amount of our money went to pay that tribute. But in 1801, the rule of Tripoli demanded a higher payment. Jefferson refused to pay, and Tripoli declared war on the United States. Jefferson replied by sending a fleet to blockade the coast of Tripoli. The pirates actually captured a U.S. warship, the USS Philadelphia. It ran aground on a reef that was uncharted, and they threw all their heavy stuff like their cannons overboard to try to get higher so they could get off the reef, but it didn't work, and they ended up being captured. And the pirates towed their prize warship into the harbor. A brave captain by the name of Stephen Decatur sneaked into the harbor with a small raiding party and basically lit the ship on fire and blew it up so that the pirates couldn't use it. That'd be a great movie if they made it. There's a lot more details and suspense involved than he snuck in and blew it up. But 8th grade history. There was actually some other parts of this war. We bombarded some towns. I believe we took some forts. There was a land invasion by Marines who landed down the coast in like Alexandria. The short story is we invaded them and stopped paying tribute in 1805. The slightly longer version, the history in 3 minutes, can be in this YouTube video that, if I refresh the screen, would hopefully pop up. More problems on the seas. So Thomas Jefferson won re-election in 1804, so that's his second term, and the nation was technically at peace, but trouble was brewing. France and Britain were in a pretty nasty conflict known as Napoleonic Wars. The war started in 1803, and the USA was able to enjoy neutral rights. These rights basically say that in the events of wars between other nations, the U.S. ships, or any ships really, could continue business as usual without taking sides. Sort of like, that's not our problem, leave us alone, and everyone goes, okay, it's not the U.S.'s problem, we're going to just leave them alone, let them do their thing. But in 1805, that became a lot more difficult. Both France and Britain were making efforts to hurt each other in any way that they could, and that meant disrupting supplies, even from the U.S., who was, chosen to stay neutral and had neutral rights. So Britain actually blockaded France, so U.S. ships couldn't get in there. Then France announced that it would seize any ships it caught trading with Britain. Sort of the USA got caught in the middle of it. The British also had this practice that they called impressment, which means forcing sailors to serve in the Royal Navy. Being a sailor in the Royal Navy was brutal work. Not many liked it, and the pay wasn't good. As a result, many would desert. and then go work on private ships, like private American ships, like the merchant vessels. The Royal Navy had been at war for a few years at this point, 1805, and was hard-pressed for manpower. They would search American vessels for sailors who had deserted from the Royal Navy and take them back. What they started doing, however, was just taking any sailors, even if they didn't have proof that they were a deserter. So you ended up having American sailors just being taken and forced into basically hard labor in the British Navy. This infuriated the American people, and some called for war with Britain. Jefferson would not have it. He sought to avoid the wars. Secretary of State James Madison, however, did call it an outrage. In December of 1807, to punish Britain, Congress passed what's called the Embargo Act. This act did not just ban trade with Britain, though, but all imports and exports to and from all foreign countries. This was done basically so merchants couldn't just use other countries as middlemen to continue trade with Britain. Basically, Congress didn't want any American goods getting to Britain whatsoever, so they just banned all imports and exports. It was a disaster. Basically, that's how the American economy ran, was imports and exports. And when those aren't allowed, that means all those ships just sit around not doing anything, and all the sailors go unemployed. It was bad. It was finally repealed, the Embargo Act, in 1809, and replaced with what's called the Non-Intercourse Act, which prohibited trade with just Britain and France. So we went from everyone, and they're like, oh, that was terrible, so they just repealed that and replaced it with an embargo on Britain and France specifically. This act was less restrictive, but still pretty unpopular because we did a lot of trading with those two countries. But they didn't really care, Britain and France. Britain, for example, just got their goods from other places. It just didn't have the effect that they were hoping. That moves us into the election of 1808. Basically, Jefferson followed Washington's precedent and only ran for president twice. So he did 2 terms and called it quits. As successor, the Republicans, the Democratic Republicans, chose James Madison. The Federalists hoped that people would still be angry about the Embargo Act and nominated Charles Pinckney. Pinckney carried New England but lost everywhere else. Once again, there would be a Democratic Republican president. So you can see here Madison won quite handily. Remember, the Northeast there is always generally a Federalist stronghold. Okay, so Madison inherited quite a problem when he assumed office, and Britain and France were still fighting and still searching and seizing American ships. Current embargoes seemed ineffective. In 1810, Congress made a new law. Basically, the U.S. would lift trade restrictions on either Britain or France, depending on who lifted their restrictions on the U.S. So basically, whoever played nice with the U.S. first would be their exclusive trading partner. Well, not totally exclusive, but they wouldn't trade with Britain. So if France said, all right, we're not going to take your ships anymore, okay, we'll trade with you, France. Or the other way around with Britain. Britain didn't really react to this new policy, but Napoleon thought it was great, and he said, okay, we'll stop taking your ships, and then you can lift your restrictions on us. However, French ships continued to search and seize American ships abroad. Americans were super mad. They wanted war. Some people thought we should go to war with Britain. Some people thought we should go to war with France. Madison was fairly certain that Britain was the more dangerous threat. So there were problems at home as well as abroad. Basically, Ohio had applied for statehood in 1803, and there had been treaties with the natives saying, okay, if you go past this line, we promise not to go past this line. You can have everything beyond there. And the problem is that settlers ignored those treaties and kept moving into Indian Territory anyways. The natives got pretty mad. They had these 2 leaders, Tecumseh, and Tecumseh's brother was simply called the Prophet. Tecumseh was a skilled tactician, and the Prophet, his brother, was sort of a cultural bulwark. He encouraged natives to go back to their more traditional ways. He was a good speaker, sort of a spiritual leader, if you will. Let's see, Tecumseh and his brother were Shawnee. They were building a confederacy of tribes to oppose this sort of American expansion further and further west. They were mad that the treaties kept getting broken. They founded a town all the way in Indiana, which was the far, far, far west back then. It was called Prophetstown. The Ohio governor, a guy by the name of William Henry Harrison, who we'll learn about more later, saw the rising threat of these brothers and sent them a warning, but the brothers just weren't going to back down. There's Tecumseh. Basically, Harrison attacked Provincetown while Tecumseh was away. So he was the military guy, leaving only the prophet there, who wasn't much of a military leader. After 2 hours, native forces fled. It's called the Battle of Tippecanoe, and was technically a victory for Americans, but it would have consequences come the War of 1812 with Britain. Now Tecumseh and his natives would basically become allies of the British. Meanwhile, back in Washington, D.C., Madison faced mounting pressure for a war from a young group of Republicans called the Warhawks. Warhawks represented basically the South and the West, but not the Federalist stronghold of the Northeast. Warhawks wanted increased military spending and more land, so they're sort of expansionists. They were nationalism, or loyalty and pride in country, appealed to the resurgence of American patriotism that was generally happening within the United States. By spring of 1812, the pressure had mounted so great, there had been too many incidents of impressment, that Madison could no longer avoid war. He asked Congress to declare war against Britain. Britain had actually just repealed their search and seizure policy, but it was too late. The war machine was already fired up. So that's it for today. If you move on to your assignment, it's a simple writing assignment. All you're going to do is say, oh, hey, which of the there we go. Which of the challenges that the United States faced in this period do you feel is the most serious? Write a paragraph telling me which one and why. So you could write about things like the pirates in the Mediterranean, the violation of neutral rights, impressment, war with natives in the West. You could talk about the Embargo Act or the Non-Intercourse Act. Pretty much any problem that we talked about in this lesson. You could say you think that was the most serious and tell me why in a simple paragraph. 4 more sentences, please. Check your spelling and grammar. It's worth 10 points. That's it. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, have a wonderful day.